some catch up with things involved too. So with the 3 classes that I teach here, parenting class, the anger management class, and the men's DV class, we have a curriculum. It's pretty dry and boring, I think, if we were to follow that workbook. I tend to bring in more practical things that I learned as a teacher, a parent myself, a counselor, life experience, and help people make connections as a whole. So obviously everything's going to apply to all of those subjects, because as we grow in our awareness of ourselves, it's going to positively affect all those things. A lot of the things that we deal with, which is what I usually start out with, is social conditioning. So in our society, we're conditioned. We're taught things. And a lot of those things affect us negatively. They're not correct. They're not true. And we go through our lives and we believe that these things are true, but if you look around, you see a lot of chaos. And that chaos seems to be increasing. It doesn't seem to be decreasing. In some ways, chaos can be good because maybe it means that things are rising to the surface. So a lot of things come down to the decisions that we make. And we make certain decisions typically based on our trauma. And there's certain driving forces that create that. So connection, wanting people to accept us. We will make decisions sometimes and give our power away without even realizing it. So I was going to talk today about this ideal, and I see this a lot. And I made connections to my own life with it. So I do this activity with clients. When I work with kids, I do this. It sounds simple. It's called 3 wishes. But I have adults do it too. And I say, what are 3 wishes you've always had? They don't have to do with stuff. They can do with anything. Wanting the world to be the way that you want it to be. Wanting your relationships to be the way that you want it to be. And that's how you can identify what people's ideals are. You'll see kids do this a lot. So when I do this with kids, let's say I have a kid who is getting in trouble a lot at school. And he wants to be right next to one of his parents all the time. And his parents got divorced. And he's acting aggressive and doesn't want his siblings around. So if you just look at that situation, it's really hard to figure out what's going on. So you have to break it down. There's 3 functions of behavior. So we look at that first. Right? There's power and control. Those go together. So power and control go together. And then there's attention. And there's avoidance. And having been a teacher, we look at that a lot in regard to student behavior, but it applies to human behavior as a whole, clearly. So we look at that and we say, okay, what might be going on? So if you look at the ideal, the 3 wishes, and let's say this little boy says, my wish is that my mom would only pay attention to me. And not my sister and my brother. And it makes me angry when she pays attention to other people. Okay. So right there you know that he has an ideal in his mind. So his ideal is, I want my mom to myself. I wish my siblings didn't take up any of her attention. Right, so then we know that The function of his behavior is to get attention from his mom. So he might get in trouble at school so that she has to take off of work, go get him, only pay attention to him to have that need met. A lot of kids have these ideals. So I can tell you based on experience how these ideals sometimes lead into a systemic problem if people don't face these ideals. So what it really comes down to is facing reality. So we know with addiction, there's something called the addiction tree. We know with addiction that addiction results from avoiding reality. A lot of people struggle with reality. It's hard to be a realist. It's much easier to be an idealist. But if you hold on to some ideals, it creates control, right? So we have to be aware. And we're all human. So a lot of these doctrines and religions, they all talk about, I have some issues with some of the things because they talk about getting to a state of like complete peace. And I don't know. I think that causes people to think that they're failing in some way if they're being human. So they're like fixated on being a good person or being better. So it creates this competitive aspect, which is basically bypassing. It's like they're bypassing things, reading things, thinking that they're supposed to be peaceful, happy, nice all the time, and that they're failing in some way. Does that make sense? And so that in itself creates an ideal, rather than helping people be in the moment as the human being that they are and accept reality as it is. Like right now, it's chaos all around us. There's nothing we can do about it. There's an aspect to it that we have to accept. That's why when I work with people who are in grief, which is just about everybody, but more systemic grief, I tell them I don't believe in the grief process as it was outlined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, that you get to acceptance. I believe you have no choice but to accept something because it already happened. And then you continue to grieve if you allow yourself to grieve. And that is sort of ongoing. It's not really a process. It's kind of a lifestyle. It is a way of life because we're always grieving something. There's always some kind of change. However, we learn to cope with it and find some kind of meaning in it. That's kind of the existential stuff. We find some meaning in it. But in our culture, we're taught to push it away, which makes it hard for people to accept what's going on. And then they want to change what's going on and control what's going on. And that doesn't work. So whatever circumstance you have, it's about looking at that circumstance and saying, okay, what can I learn from this circumstance? Because I've had history repeat itself quite a few times with people taking advantage of me or not respecting my boundaries. And we all have blind spots based on our trauma. So the ideal, I'll show you what the ideal creates just by using my own personal example. Personal example. So my mom comes from a small town here, and so does my dad, Estancia Torion. And so this is my mom's mom and her dad. And they considered themselves Catholic. Okay? And my grandma had an 8th grade education. And her husband was a school teacher, so he did have some college education. They had 11 kids because that was kind of the norm in that religion, which I think is inhumane to have anybody have that many pregnancies. I think she had like 14 pregnancies. And it's inhumane in the sense that you're going to have a bunch of kids who are going to be fighting for attention, and there's going to be a whole bunch of issues. And then economically, there's just a lot of issues with that belief system that God gives you the amount of kids that they want you to have. I mean, that doesn't mean that you have the resources to have that. Doesn't mean you have the emotional energy to take care of that. And what we know about trauma, there's going to be trauma here. So my mom was one of the younger ones of the 11. She's like right here. And so he ends up getting a brain tumor and dying. And he had a lot of issues apparently, like sexual abuse that was happening, pretending to be super Catholic. And I say pretending because he's obviously listening to some doctrine and using it, but it's not really sinking in. Because I'm not saying that religion is horrible. I'm saying the way that it's been misused can be seen as problematic because some people use it to their benefit. So he dies, and my grandma has to get 2 jobs to take care of all these kids. Some of them are teenagers. I think my mom was 5. So there's like 6 boys, 5 girls. And she creates this ideal. I figured this out later because we're like a trillion-piece puzzle. So people are either reflecting or they're projecting. So they're either gathering pieces to their puzzle or they're adding pieces to their puzzle. If you're gathering pieces to your puzzle, you're trying to figure out things by looking at your past, by taking information like this and realizing what's going on in your life. So she creates this ideal because my grandma gets very busy. And between birth and age 7 is when our trauma happens. And all of it is subconscious. So we take in most of our social conditioning by that time. So she creates an ideal in her mind that she and her mom are close. That she's the favorite. And she kind of dominates. She gets kind of scary. She gets kind of mean. So later, I'm the oldest. I have 2 younger brothers. So I'm born. By this time, my grandma's already raised kids. She's tired. I don't think she really had an interest in kids. She was working at a church, like doing cleaning and ironing clothes for priests and whatever. So my mom pushes me on her as part of her ideal. That would be one of her 3 wishes. That she and her mom were close, and that she is the favorite. So she's already creating a disparity and some divisiveness, and some negative aspects within her family and with her siblings. So I don't know what's going on, because I'm little, so she pushes me on her. And then by the time I'm like 8, my family already doesn't like me, like my aunt and my cousin, because it appears as though I'm her favorite, even though I don't think she cared one way or another. And then I grow up in a dysfunctional household. I get pregnant at 17 with a girl, and my mom takes her. So she takes her from me because she now wants to have another ideal that she and my daughter are close. So she wants another do-over. So she keeps creating these ideals that stem from her childhood because she's unconscious of it. She's not conscious of what's happening. Just like that little boy is unconscious, even though when he said it out loud, it kind of brings it to consciousness. Oh, I want my mom all to myself. I'm saying it out loud. I don't think she ever said it out loud. So that was the repercussions. She created a ripple effect of negativity. Damaged relationships with her sisters, damaged relationship with me, created friction all around here, and it just rippled out into a mess. A mess. And I don't know that she even wants to see it to this day. Because this narrative in her mind has existed for so long that all it's done is cause her suffering and cause other people suffering. So The good news is this has really helped me as a therapist, as difficult as that situation has been in my life. Because now I'm able to see it in other people. The more they hold on to an ideal, the more they entangle people and create codependency with people. So people who can't let go of something, they want this ideal in their mind that's based on social conditioning, right? You're such this calm and peaceful person. That's the ideal, right? You can't be an angry person. You have to be a calm and peaceful person. The ideal is that, whatever we see on TV. And then people think that they failed because their relationships and their family don't look like that, because it's not realistic. It's not going to look like that, because we have a lot of things to work on being human and accepting that we're human. You have to accept that you're human in order to improve the quality of your relationships. So the value of getting therapy, like for that little boy, is to help him see through the illusion so that he can understand the reality. I can't have my mom all to myself. And if I keep trying, I'm going to end up damaging trust. I'm going to end up damaging this relationship. I'm going to damage the relationship with my siblings. I'm going to damage the relationship with my stepdad. And I'm going to get lots of attention along the way. My mom got lots of attention, but it was always negative attention. It didn't meet the core need of what she wanted. The core need of what everybody wants is connection. They try getting it through control. And so as a result, because it becomes our point of attraction, I've attracted a lot of people who control me or try to. They kind of have been somewhat successful at it until I pull away from it. So that in and of itself is an issue for a lot of people that creates addiction, since addiction is the desire to avoid reality. If somebody can say, like I had a teenager yesterday, she was in my office, she has extreme anxiety, she broke down as she's getting ready to apply to colleges and was like, I don't like this reality. It's a turning point when people recognize that they don't like what exists. So the first step in the 12-step program is to identify that a problem exists. So that's moving people out of ideal to real. When they can say these problems exist in our culture. Maybe global warming does exist and we've turned a blind eye to it. Maybe all these things do exist and we're not paying attention to it. And it moves people into that reality of, oh, well, do I really want to go to college? Oh, I'm just going to have to work. I'm doing all this to work and make money. And it's unsettling to some people when they wake up to the reality of the way things are. But they can't really build the life they want until they do, because they're in a delusion. And some people will carry those delusions ongoing. They'll be in a relationship with someone. I'll talk. So when I was 17, I ended up with a 24-year-old, and I ended up getting pregnant. And he was not pleasant. He was not pleasant, and his stepmom was not pleasant. She liked to drink and smoke with him, and he didn't really want to take active steps to better his life, even if that was afforded to him. And so he created this ideal. We can create all kinds of ideals. He created this ideal that his dad, who was irresponsible, never paid child support, never was really there. Again, similar to my mom, that his dad cared about him when really they were exploiting him. And his dad had another child that he never even took care of or acknowledged for years. So the ideal that he had was to beef up this stepmom, which was an avenue to his dad. So he would basically call her mom, do everything she wanted, try to have my kids call her grandma, even though she really didn't play any active role as a grandparent. And she came into his life when he was an adult. He wasn't a child, so she didn't have any active role in raising him. It's all just this delusion of, I want my dad to notice me. Again, it's attention. It's part of an abandonment wound. It's, if my dad notices me, then, and I can do it through this person, then I can get this idealistic need met. Instead of looking at what's real, which most people don't want to look at. If he had to look and face what's real, he could probably heal some of the lack of motivation. He could heal some of the addiction. If he could say, yeah, my dad was never really there. My dad didn't really take care of us. My dad didn't pay child support. And trying to get him to love me by doing everything his stepmom or his wife wants, who was his stepmom, to get his acceptance, only held him back. Because he never finished school, never really did, he stayed in a job doing construction that caused a lot of health issues, didn't really try to better himself, and then they've enabled things. So instead of helping him, they have given him money, or like other family members when he's gotten sick, or never allowing him to grow into the better version of himself. So in other words, these ideals can keep us stuck. So the point of this lesson is to identify where you have ideals. And ask yourself if they're realistic or if they're driving your life. Some people can't accept when a relationship is over, so they continue to punish that person by not paying their child support, by telling all kinds of lies, by telling stories, and then they think they're going to get somewhere with that. It's like, no, you're going to drive that person further and further away where they just can't stand you, which is the point I got to with my ex-husband. I'm like, I don't want anything at all to do with you. I don't even want to hear about you because you create so much chaos with your ideals that I can't be around it. So where you have ideals. So it works against them because what's lacking is vulnerability. That's what's lacking. It takes vulnerability to say what you really want and know that it might be unrealistic and that you might not get it. That takes some vulnerability. It would take some vulnerability for him to say, yeah, I just wanted my dad to love me. Your dad might not be capable. But it's good to say it because then it takes you out of the ideal into the reality. And then you stop damaging other people as a result of your ideal. So when you're able to look at your ideals and you're able to be vulnerable enough, like that little boy I was talking about, when he says, well, yeah, I just want my mom all to myself. It does take some vulnerability to say that. It's kind of easier to get some kids to say that because they don't have all the defense mechanisms yet. So it's easier to work with them in that regard. Some kids do already have the defense mechanisms. But once people have an ideal and they anchor onto that ideal, sometimes it's really hard. And they will fight tooth and nail and damage a lot of things as a result of that. And basically they end up hurting themselves the most as a result of their ideal. Because they take things from other people that aren't theirs, they violate boundaries, they give their own power away, they don't meet their own goals, they find a scapegoat to blame. Instead of looking at the actual source of the problem. Or the actual source of where the difficulties are coming from and accept that reality. So for my mom, it was accepting the reality that her mom didn't abandon them, but had to go to work to provide for them, and that all of them mattered equally, and that she wasn't a favorite, and that favorites don't exist or shouldn't exist. And that fair and equal are different. So she would have to face that reality. My ex-husband would have to face the reality that his dad really just wanted to party with his wife and invited him over and thought everything was a party and never really was a responsible parent. He would have to be vulnerable enough to accept that reality and say, yeah, I wanted a responsible parent. And instead of becoming a responsible parent myself, by looking at the lack, the contrast, I decided to become part of the problem instead of part of the solution. So when we have contrast, we can become part of the problem or we can become part of the solution. If we stay in the ideal, we become part of the problem. So with my mom, I didn't want to stay and enable that ideal for her because I didn't want to become part of that problem with her. And sometimes that means not having good relationships with people because you can't. If they're living a delusion and you don't want to live that, I could have stayed married to my ex-husband and partied too and been part of that delusion, but I wouldn't be standing here teaching these classes. I wouldn't have the degrees that I have. I wouldn't have the life that I have now. I wouldn't have gone on to have my other children and be married now for 22 years to someone else that is pretty solid. I wouldn't have had that experience if I would have fed into that ideal with him. If I would have enabled it and been like, yeah, poor you. Because people get confused by compassion. They think compassion and empathy is sitting there with them and enabling them. And saying, poor you, I know your dad wasn't there for you, so let's all go party together and let's not reach our highest potential. So that you can feel like you're meeting a need or a void, but you're not. You're just putting a sparkly Band-Aid on it. You can't meet that need or that void until A, you recognize what's happening, and then you do something to step out of it. So I did things to step out of those situations and saying, this is your stuff. I'm not going to be in a web of codependency with your stuff. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to make excuses for you. I'm not going to live that ideal and that delusion with you. I can have compassion for you from a distance and say, yeah, we're all human and we all have trauma. But that's not what I'm going to participate in. I still have a life to live, and I want to do things with that life rather than sit around and become part of the addiction with people who can't face the reality of the things that they create or their own ideals. That's why they say things span 7 generations until someone breaks that. I believe I'm the person that breaks that in my family lines because I'm the person strong enough and willing to look at it. A lot of people, it's too hard for them. They will stay enmeshed and entangled and codependent with it because it's easier than taking the abuse and being the scapegoat. Because if you start shedding light on the fact that if he was to face what he's actually doing and you start shining light on that, the abuse comes. The abuse starts being projected at you. You're stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. Your degree's worthless. Look at how close we are. That isn't really close. It's just covering up an ideal, but never really getting to the source of the problem. So, does this speak to you in any way?
Yes.
Yeah? Mm-hmm. Can you think of some family members or some situations where this exists in your life? It also is about facing yourself and seeing where, it's not just the external, it's also the internal. It's easy to see it in other people, but it's also looking at ourselves and saying, where do I hold an ideal that is a problem? But being able to see it in your family, then you can step out of it and say, I'm not going to be a part of this ideal because that's what creates the toxicity. Yeah. Any thoughts, insights, anything? So it's a hard one to face.
Well, like before all of this had happened, because I was kind of like, before I wasn't like drinking as much.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I lost my dad the day before my birthday in November, and I had to go and travel out there, and being the oldest, I had to do the whole funeral and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I was out here doing all of that. I was out there doing all of that. I did the funeral. I came back, and then I found out that my son's dad, he was cheating while I was doing all of that, and I came back, and it was too soon for me. Too soon for me. And after that, I just cut it off because it wasn't the first or the second remove. So I just kind of just cut everybody out. And then I started to be, try to just find something that made me happy. And I leaned to alcohol. And it was kind of like, oh, it's just once a week. But once a week, it was like, oh, I feel like this. I want to do more. I want to do more,
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, I was still doing what I had to do. I was still going to work. I was still being responsible. So I thought I was being okay. But it was still bothering me. It still bothers me today because I cut everything out of my life, and I'm still stuck at my son's dad's place because I couldn't. I tried to get an apartment, so it's just kind of like everything was just rolling the punches at me. So I'm just kind of just going with it, day by day. That's all I can do right now.
Well, I hope this information helps you reflect on all of that. Here's the key thing. The reason this happens is because our culture doesn't. It's kind of what I started with. Our culture doesn't understand grief, and it doesn't let people grieve. Keeps us in a constant state of stress and gaslighting and shaming that if you're in grief and you talk about it, most people's attitude about things of the past is, that's in the past, don't talk about it. If that causes you pain, don't look at that. Don't think about that person. It's like, that's a very simple-minded approach to grief. And that's someone who's just suppressing. And then they're shaming you because that's the way they've handled it. Eventually, they handle it that way, and they're probably creating chaos with their ideals. I had a friend tell me that this friendship's not fun when I was going through things, and I was like, well, it's not. Relationships aren't always fun all the time. You're not going to be happy all the time. We have an array of emotions, so we don't let people grieve. So then they resort to ideals to cope, and then their ideals just create more circumstances for people to grieve, and it becomes a disaster. If we would let people grieve in the first place, and we would tell them that it's okay to grieve, they wouldn't create these ideals. And if we could tell kids, yeah, it's okay for you to feel like you're sad about your life circumstances. However, we also have to look at what is real regarding your life circumstances. We can't shield you from those realities. Because if we do, then we're just creating an idealistic world that doesn't exist. We can't pretend that all these things going on around us don't exist and try to create this ideal. I've even thought about it with this new wave of things of, oh, we're moving to the fifth dimension, which is we're evolving, but it's an ideal, and I'm thinking, is this real? I've thought about that lately. I'm like, is this just another way of escaping facing what's happening? Is it just a hope or a wishful thinking that if I can find my center and I can find peace, that I'm going to bypass this chaos that we've all contributed to as a collective? Or do I have to do my own part to face it and see it? Do we all have to do our own part to face it and see it? People pray for some kind of rapture or some kind of heaven, and it's like, yeah, that's a nice thought, but is it realistic? Yeah, we all want an ideal family, but is it realistic with the level of trauma people have and the amount of grief they hold that they haven't addressed? Until we all do that, then we're just going to keep creating what we're creating. And I don't think that there's some magical thing that's coming to save anybody. They have to face it. They have to face reality. And that's not an easy, fun thing to face. And if it means that our planet caves in because we've done certain things, then we're going to cave in with it. And we have to accept that as a reality. It's not pessimistic, it's realistic. And there may not be something coming to save the good people, in quotes, when everyone contributed. at some level. And until everyone takes responsibility, then we may all just cave in with it. Or we can start looking at these things and be realistic, which most people don't. That's not the party they want to be invited to. They want to be invited to the someone's coming to save me party. It's like, well, this is the only party that's really going to yield anything. It's not the funnest party. All right. Well, thank you guys for being here. I hope that helps you with some things. So I give you permission to grieve. Okay? Because that's part of the healing process.
Just kind of gotta accept it.
Yeah, I give you permission to grieve. I give you permission to feel. And nothing's going to get us out of this except us being realistic. And stop saying ridiculous things like, that doesn't exist, that doesn't exist, that doesn't exist, that doesn't exist. It does exist. It's easier to say things don't exist. My dad's child that he had and never took care of doesn't exist. Well, that's a human being. I mean, they don't exist. I'm just going to put them out of my mind. And I want his attention. Those kinds of things create the toxicity. It's like, no, you got to face that your dad has another child that's your sibling that he never took care of. And that he didn't take care of you either. Face it. There's a good scene in Good Will Hunting where the counselor, if you've seen that movie, at the end he helps him face the reality of the abuse that he endured instead of running from it. And it was through that facing of that abuse that he was able to get to the other side of it and not get stuck. All right. So good to see you guys. I'll see you next week. Okay.
See you next week.
Take care. Thanks for being here. Enjoy the rest of your free day.
I know, right?
Yeah. All right. You guys take care.